There is a good chance you do not understand asexuality. There's a good chance you do not understand it very well. And in particular, you probably have an understanding about sexuality writ large that deserves to be deconstructed for your betterment, for everybody else's betterment. And I want to start here with a conversation that ace folks have been trying to have for a while, or on the other hand, conversations that ace folks have been tired of having for a while.
Oh, really? What's your major? Oh, it's mathematics. Wow, you're so smart. I could never do that.
I cannot keep having the same conversation.
So this is Kate Minghui. This is one of numerous content creators on social media that talks about asexuality, that gets into ace theory. And these kinds of conversations are one that you're likely to be familiar with if you know anything about the asexual experience at all. Ace folks are often completely misunderstood and discriminated against, and the ways in which that happens is emblematic of a problem we have in culture with leaving people alone when it comes to their feelings about sex and their own distance from sex. Does that make sense? So the reason that we got here in the first place is because last week in my conversation about people calling Gen Z puritanical, why people call Gen Z puritanical, and the mishmash of different half-substantiated opinions that followed that, a lot of which concerned Gen Z's attitudes about sex and include, as part of their concern about Gen Z's attitudes towards sex, the statistics showing that apparently Gen Z has a lot less sex than previous generations. We got a great comment from someone named Chiriri123 who says that when this topic comes up, they were reminded of how much asexual theory people need to be way more widespread. That a lot of this conversation would be more fulfilling if people actually listen to ace people. Instead, we often just say, oh, and ace people exist, LOL, and quickly move on. And I'm pretty guilty of this. I'm as guilty of this as anybody in some cases because I have friends that are on the ace spectrum. My editor, Danae, who's ace, often helps give me insight on that and talks about that, was one of the commenters who was bringing this up in the last video as well. And I try my best to make sure I make mention of ace people here and there, make them feel included, but that's really not enough to understand what's going on in terms of why people are weird about asexuality and why asexual people experience not only discrimination but other forms of oppression. This commenter in particular recommended the book Refusing Compulsory Sexuality by Sherronda J. Brown, and I was really curious to dive into that. The full title of the book is Refusing Compulsory Sexuality, a Black Asexual Lens on Our Sex-Obsessed Culture. And Sherronda J. Brown is a great writer. I've started reading this book. I read this excerpt as well as other excerpts, and I have to say that the book brings up some conversations that might make people a little bit uncomfortable, might cause a little bit of discourse, but I think that we're at a point where these things have to be talked about in order for us to understand things like racism and sexism and queer phobia more. First, I'm going to go with the sort of definition and explanation of asexuality that Brown puts forth in this excerpt, in the introduction of the book. Asexual is a descriptor that has been adopted by many people who identify with the definition of having little to no sexual attraction and or desire, while others might gravitate toward varying levels of sexual attraction and or desire, and others might find themselves experiencing only secondary sexual attraction and or desire in acutely specific contexts or only with specific people, only after forming emotional bonds. This is part of the tricky thing about labels, is that they're useful, but they're also confusing, and people have different reflections on what those labels mean. Meanwhile, others might describe themselves as someone who experiences sexual desire but has little to no inclination to ever act upon it with another person, or they might say that they simply prefer not to have sex, have opted out of sex, never want to have anything to do with sex, just never cared about sex, or like the idea of sex more than sex itself. Some may not have pinned down the best language to describe or talk about their personal relationship to sex, attraction, and desire, but they find a home in asexuality nonetheless because they recognize their experience as being atypical, as outside the normativity of allosexuality. And allosexuality is essentially the term that describes the opposite of asexual, the sort of normative sexual experience / identity with which to contrast asexuality. Okay? People on the ace spectrum can also fluctuate in their feelings towards sex as a characteristic of their asexuality, while some remain firmly in the position of either sex repulsed, sex indifferent, or sex favorable. There are aces who are more fluid between two or all three. Fluctuation can also take place between asexuality and allosexuality, with some people finding themselves falling somewhere in a gray area with a notable amount of flexibility or neutrality. In other respects, ace people can and do experience other types of attraction, and some seek out relationships and partnerships based on those attractions. Regardless of how we might come into asexuality and claim the term as something that describes how we relate to sexual attraction and desire, whether it be absent, rare, secondary, or contextual, it's all valid. Okay, and I'll close this little excerpt by reading an excerpt in the excerpt from Lisa Orlando's 1972 text, The Asexual Manifesto, where she defines asexual as not meaning without sex, but relating sexually to no one. Asexuality is simply self-contained sexuality. Okay, so these are the definitions of asexuality. Curious for you guys what you're thinking. What's coming up? Does this make sense? Does it not make sense? I'm also curious if it feels like maybe this conversation is a little peripheral, not that important, not that relevant to what we might experience with sexuality, as though the ace person is just maybe that weird person, or we don't want to say weird because that's judgy, but maybe that different person, that rare person that exists that maybe should be accounted for more and obviously treated with respect, but you know, it doesn't reflect some sort of larger problem, right? It's relevant and it's complex. I think that is a good way to put it, Hannah Kane. I also do think that when we see this, it's easy to start picking up on why asexual folks might get discriminated against, especially when for a lot of people these complexities and this uniqueness makes it so that these folks seem like they shouldn't be catered to. And this is where we have to talk about acephobia, right? Because one study that was last updated in April this month from Human Rights Campaign, their findings from a LGBTQ plus community survey last year, shows that asexual respondents report sharper declines in acceptance, outness, and visibility. There's some numbers there. Less acceptance, 50.9% versus where LGBTQ plus adults were at 29.7%. Less out, less visible, similar things. Yasmin Benoit, who is a pretty famous asexual activist, has a comment saying that the asexual community has long been regarded as one of the least visible groups within the wider LGBTQAI or IA plus community. It's one of the communities least likely to come out, to be represented, to have legislative recognition, or to receive support from LGBTQ plus groups and organizations, all while facing many of the same issues as the rest of the LGBTQ plus community. This should be alarming to us as folks that are interested. Obviously, I would hope if you're watching this video, you're interested in liberation and protection and solidarity with marginalized people. This kind of thing should probably strike you as a bit disturbing. And I think in order to understand it, we actually have to get a little further with our politics than we're used to when it comes to how we talk about queer issues, how we talk about LGBTQ plus issues. And that starts with one statement, one thing that I want to stamp as an important takeaway of this video. Off rip, inclusivity is not enough. So what I was referring to earlier in terms of my own experience, how I try to include ace people in conversations, how I try to sometimes be, ace friendly with my rhetoric and my language. These things are important. And honestly, ace people aren't beating down the doors, screaming at people to please treat them better. They are very understanding and respectful and appreciative of even like small shout outs. But to get to the root of acephobia, this is not enough. And it goes like this for every, marginalized group. Representation and inclusivity, rare as they are and important as they are simply not enough. Trying to include ace people ignores a lot of the reality that ace people are dealing with, which is a shared reality. It ignores a lot of what the ace perspective offers us. And I think that that's almost intentional, or it's very intentional on a systematic level. Because if we had to grapple with the things that ace people experience, if we had to think about ace people's perspective, we would have some very uncomfortable questions to answer about how we view sex. So if inclusivity is not enough, then what is enough? Well, for a start, we have to go from just thinking, well, I have gay friends or I have ace friends, towards thinking, I want to understand their perspective better. That's how you know that you've built good solidarity, is that you feel like you've learned. You feel like your perspective has widened, and that you are going to not only treat people differently, but that you're going to reflect on yourself differently and reflect on how you've been socialized, how your family, friends, society has shaped you, and think about how you're going to now try to change your behavior so that society changes. I think that's a really good way to clock whether or not you are making strides with your own praxis. And in this case, we don't really do this with ace people. Hell, a lot of straight people don't really do this with queer people. Straight people will often be, very kind, very cool people. People who will, honestly, like, sacrifice a lot for you. It's not a matter of personal dignity or morals, but it's very rare that you see straight people learn about queerness and really try to study queerness and the queer perspective beyond just, oh, these folks need support, or they exist, or they should be tolerated. Likewise, we really see none of that when it comes to the ace perspective. And I have to ask you why that is. Again, my point is that it doesn't sit well with us when we have to think about what the ace perspective means about our own reflections, our own relationships with sexuality. And in a lot of ways, what Dark Wolf is saying is correct in that it's a small portion of the LGBTQ plus community, so that makes it harder to learn. It's not like it's as easy to seek out an ace perspective. But then again, that's where books like Sherronda J. Brown's come in, and that's where the work people are doing online to disseminate media and theory about this comes in. So I'm going to use more quotes from Sherronda J. Brown's book to further help you understand asexuality on a deeper level and show you where those questions are going to start to come up. By the way, smash the like button. I think I have to do that as a YouTuber. I think that's like my job. So Brown writes, asexuality is defined by a relationship to sex that is atypical to what has been decided on by society at large to be normative, and that atypical nature is marked by varying degrees of sexual attraction and desire. This is big. Asexual experiences stand outside of what has been accepted and approved of as normal sexual experiences for both the queer and the heterosexual communities. So we're talking about the abnormal here. Now, when we talk about acephobia, we're talking about something that shows up, and what I'll narrow down here, but it can be more than this, into 3 specific categories, all around one idea. Something must be wrong with you. If you're asexual, something must be wrong with you. And that pops up in these 3 categories that I sort through: stigmatization, exclusion, and medicalization. Now, we'll just touch on these briefly because I really want to get more into the ideas in Brown's book. But briefly, the stigmatization comes from the idea that because you are not having sex the normal amount and you're not experiencing attraction the normal amount, you must not be normal. And there must be something wrong with you. This links very closely to medicalization. There are many parts of the medical community that still consider asexuality to be a medical issue, to be a psychological issue, something that can be fixed and sorted through, categorized, and then treated so that a person can get back to normal. Raises questions about mental health constructs in general, but that's a bigger conversation. And then exclusion, right? And exclusion can come in many different forms, but in particular, one of the things that you hear ace folks talk about a lot is, as Yasmin Benoit had pointed out, the idea that some other LGBTQ plus people have that ace people don't belong in that category. That ace folks are not queer folks, that they don't deserve queer representation, that they don't deserve some type of solidarity for being ace, all of that stuff. This brings up another TikTok actually from someone named Asexual Barbie, another one of these content creators.
Men have always run things, and there have never been any problems whatsoever. And don't say the economy or Iraq or income inequality or racism or Brett Kavanaugh or air pollution or Vietnam or slavery or Watergate or capitalism or Me Too or homelessness or police brutality or homophobia.
So, there's a whole list of different problems that are listed here that affect ace people. But in particular, it's this idea that these ace folks, they don't actually deal with real problems. It's not actually a problem to be ace. That seems to plague a lot of these conversations and seems to be a driving force behind a lot of acephobia, including from other queer folks. And you hear ace folks talk about this a lot. So these are some thoughts shared on a subreddit, Ask LGBT. The kind of hate I've seen is usually because people can't comprehend that some people don't experience sexual attraction. They assume we're ill, depressed, traumatized, or broken in some way. I've been called even a femcel/incel on more than one occasion. 2, people don't think we belong in the LGBTQ plus community because we mostly fly under the radar and aren't as oppressed. It's always the oppression Olympics thing, right? And this also speaks to why there has been some history of bisexual and asexual people having specific solidarity with each other, because bisexual people also have that kind of fluidity in their identity and that kind of comparison to other queer folks that can give you reactionary ideas that they don't suffer suffer as much as other queer people, right? And we know that that's not true. We know that's not borne out in the statistics. We know that when we talk to our bisexual friends, that they experience all different forms of queer phobia, some of which are quite unique to being bisexual, and some of them cross over into other things that other queer people experience. So the bisexual girl, for instance, can be facing queer phobia not just because if she dates a girl, people will treat her like a lesbian in the, lesbophobic way, but because she has to hide a lot of parts of herself in order to move through the world in the right way. Because when she dates men might treat her in a very biphobic way. Because she doesn't have a lot of spaces that she can feel like other people can relate to her. Various different reasons, right? And that was stuff we talked about in my video about bisexual women. Similar things happen with asexual people. Oh, well, you just don't have sex. You just don't have sex. Well, that doesn't matter. That's just you making a decision not to have as much sex. Or for whatever reason, if you think it's biological or whatever, the point is it's not important. It's not important because it's just what you're doing in your personal business and nobody's paying attention to that. You're not actually oppressed. I mean, this couldn't be further from the truth. So when we hear about cases of acephobia or things that ace people suffer from, one of the most common ones that are talked about is corrective R word, right? So this other commenter on Reddit cites a podcast episode from the Ace couple, which a lot of people have recommended as well, with a researcher named Kate Wood, talking about how ace people have the highest rates of corrective rape. A lot of those instances, like is the case with a lot of rape, are instances of partner violence and sexual pressure. When we talk about corrective rape, we talk about this idea of I'm going to fix you by forcing you into sexual behavior, by forcing you to do something that you don't want to do sexually. This is a common response to a lot of ace people, sometimes from people who are just trying to make lighthearted conversation and don't know any better, oftentimes under the guise of a threat. Right? I've heard about ace women being at bars, divulging to a man that they're ace and then being like, you just haven't had good dick yet, and I'm going to show you what that is, right? So these are the kinds of things that ace folks suffer from, and it would not make sense to say, well, that's not related to you being ace at all. Let me take a second to pause and look at the chat. Lady Gray says it makes relationships harder too. People will say they don't have a problem, but then, hey, can you just put up with sex or let me cheat on you? G. Julia's akin to the TikTok I showed earlier. You just didn't find the right person. Elliot Polar, good name. Does the ace spectrum also include folks who go through fluctuations of sex attraction? Yeah, as Sherronda J. Brown notes earlier, you don't have to, but you can identify as asexual. For instance, if you feel like your sexual attraction or drive fluctuates at a degree that feels very incongruous with what is supposed to be normal. That can be a very vast conversation, and as soon as we get into conversations of policing who counts in a category and who doesn't, it gets very hairy, but that certainly can be a part of the ace experience. There's a lot of ace people who sometimes feel sexual attraction and sometimes don't, and they identify as ace. At the end of the day, these are our labels, right? And so again, if you identify as something, as long as you have good reason to do so through research and through conversation with folks, nobody can sit here and just tell you you're not that thing. But of course, I don't want to get too much into that conversation because, I don't even really identify as ace. So it's like, how much of this is my thing to say? But I do appreciate that there are ace folks in the chat and want to hear from y'all. Much respect for those of you who are able to come forward and talk about it, right? Cruel Angel in the chat says it's difficult being ace and a teenager because people think I just need to grow up. And here's the thing, right? Like sexuality is something that of course can fluctuate or be fluid over time. Of course, we might think at one point we might belong to a category, and then through learning and experience, we might end up saying, actually, I'm more in this other category, or maybe I was there and now I'm here. So that has nothing to do with just being some sort of immature child. If a child says, yo, I think I'm asexual, it's, important to respond to them by saying, that's totally cool. And I respect that you identify that way. And that doesn't necessarily mean you're locking them into a category. You're throwing them down a chute and they can never get out of there. If you think for some reason that they might identify differently in the future, you can never get there in a healthy way with people if you don't allow them to think about what they might identify as and to work through that. That being said, once you hear somebody say I'm asexual and your response is, oh, that's just a phase, you'll change, you'll get out of it. Not only is that disrespectful, but it's also oftentimes really untrue because in my experience, I find that it's rare. This is, contrary to what a lot of right-wing propaganda might tell you. But I feel like it's rare that people are going to identify as something, as some sort of marginalized category if they haven't at least given it some thought. And especially something like asexual, right? You can talk to a person and pick up even for yourself, like, what does this person know about asexuality? sexuality? Have they looked into it enough, or have they looked into it at all? You can discern that. But like at the end of the day, you have to just keep encouraging people to think about these categories, to experiment with them if necessary. And as long as folks are coming from a healthy, like, I'm trying to educate myself place, we don't have any right to judge people or to cast their own, experiments or experiences with identity as being inferior because they're too young, because they don't have enough experience, or I know better than them about who they are. That's just meaningless stuff, basically. You're never in a position to doubt them, as RK says. So now we're going to get real spicy, right? Because what we're going to do is expand on what we've just talked about. Let's start here by posing a question. Why do you think a person might feel like if they encounter an asexual person, that person has something wrong with them? Or that they should do something about it to fix that person, or that person should try to fix themselves? Why would that be the case? There's a lot of valid answers here potentially, but in the book that we're talking about, Sherronda J. Brown uses the term compulsory sexuality. Once we go down this rabbit hole, it's a long way down, and it might get real unstable. So buckle up, tighten your core, let's get through it. Because the conversation about compulsory sexuality implicates a lot of us. First, let's talk about what compulsory sexuality is or might mean. So Brown cites Christina Gupta's paper, Compulsory Sexuality, Evaluating an Emerging Concept. Gupta defines it as an assumption that all people are sexual and describes the social norms and practices that both marginalize various forms of non-sexuality, such as a lack of sexual desire or behavior, and compel people to experience themselves as desiring subjects, take up sexual identities, and engage in sexual activity. Right? I'm going to repeat that last part. Compel people to experience themselves as desiring subjects, take up sexual identities, and engage in sexual activity. And then this last line, another one to take note of. This ideology regulates the behavior of all people, not just those who identify as asexual. Whoa. Let me say that again. This ideology regulates the behavior of all people, not just those who identify as asexual. Did everybody buckle up? How are we feeling? Is there a lot of turbulence going on in this plane? So the reason that this is important is because what we're essentially saying is, it's not that ace people are abnormal. First of all, which of course that's like a mean thing to say, but why is it a mean thing to say? What's the deeper, implication here? The implication is that we're all living under a construct, an idea of how sexual we should be. And that ace folks are just the ones who, through whatever they might be experiencing in their own lives, through whatever combination of biological or sociological or whatever factors, are folks who are saying, I can't live in that construct. That doesn't work for me. I'm opting out of it. Okay, it's not contradictory to the idea that ace people might be born the way that they are, or that other people of other sexualities might be born with, certain attractions, certain compulsions. That's not a denial of people's own lived experience. That's saying that lived experience is situated in an idea of normal. And that idea of normal might have a lot of implications about how we conduct ourselves. Does that make sense? We think certain things are normal when it comes to sex. And it gets uncomfortable when we talk to ace people, because when they've opted out of that normal, what's to say that we shouldn't as well? Or that there is something to opt out of to begin with? Or that there is some sort of normal that isn't just natural and isn't just something you just assume is always going to be there and not worth investigating, but is actually something socially constructed and in a lot of ways carried out by people in power, by systems that we live under. Diara Wisteria says, I had issues for years because of compat and aphobia, even though it turned out that I wasn't ace, being pushed to act in certain ways because of those, but being unable to live like that hurt me. April Kim has a two-parter. As a Korean non-aro ace person, I felt so isolated from both conservative Korean culture for having conservative ideas about sex, but also with Western sex positivity, here we go, due to its rampant racism and sex positivity being so Western. So learning from ace people about sex has been helping up with my own fucked up sexuality. Well, I mean, I wouldn't call anybody fucked up for their sexuality, but I get why you would say that. Internalized ace phobia is something I'm still working on. Yeah, another way to think about internalized ace phobia is to think about it as how we deal with compulsory sexuality. And this term comes from the original term, or it's sort of a derivative or a variation of the term compulsory heterosexuality. We all understood that to be like, yeah, people are essentially forced to be straight or pushed to be straight. And that happens in so many ways that are like implicit, that are subtle, that are assumed, as well as a lot of the ways that are very violent and very vigorous. Same thing goes with sexuality in general. That's like the big almost mindfuck about asexuality, is that ace folks in a lot of ways are to sexual folks or to allo folks what maybe gay folks are to straight folks, right? There's a lot of like convergence there. There's a lot of similarity there. And so let's talk a little bit about what compulsory sexuality might be. So at the start of this paper by Christina Gupta that Brown cites, Gupta notes, for instance, an interview with David J., who was the founder of an online community for asexual people, on MSNBC's Tucker Carlson program. This was 2006, so that's where things were in 2006.
Now, how does asexuality differ from celibacy?
Well, celibacy is a choice.
Carlson, a news commentator with a conservative social agenda, asked Jay a number of skeptical questions, including,
So you don't think about sex?
I don't desire sex. I mean, I see sex in the world around me all the time, so I think about it, I know that it's there.
Yes, but you're aware that the average man has a porn movie on a continuous loop going in his brain at all times, and you don't?
I've been told that more or less. I have a hard time believing it, but if you say so.
And in 2011, Jay was interviewed for a podcast by Dan Savage, a pro-sex advice columnist. Although Savage attempted to find common ground with Jay, during the interview he made the following statement. When you date, the assumption for 99% of humanity is that you're out there dating and looking for a mate, in part because you want to, well, mate. And if you aren't, you have an obligation to disclose you aren't. If you're presenting yourself as a carbon-based life form, a vertebrate, and you're allowing people to assume you are, this is wordy, you're allowing people to assume you are a vertebrate because almost all humans are, you have an obligation to disclose that you're actually a jellyfish. Bizarre wording, but what both interviewers were trying to drive at, for one, is something that we still see to this day, a lot of these assumptions, and we'll get into it. But also, it's just the idea that, like, whether or not it's okay to be asexual, the average person is really horny and really sexual, and that's pretty normal. And so, ace people, you know, we respect you, just make sure you disclose and make sure you figure all that stuff out. But when we think about these ideas, is it true that the average person is very sexual, is very horny, that the average person wants to mate? What is this idea of the average person, and what are we basing these ideas on? So when we think about compulsory sexuality, we can think of it manifesting in various ways. Here's one example that I thought of that comes to mind a lot. For instance, sexless as a pejorative. What do I mean by this? My marriage is sexless. Now, is a person being acephobic when they talk about their marriage negatively because it's sexless, because there's no sex in it? Not necessarily. Maybe, maybe not. But the very assumption that because something is sexless, there's no sexuality in this thing, well, that must be a negative. That's compulsory sexuality. Same thing goes for an idea like, are you having a healthy amount of sex? Do you have a healthy sex drive? These are ideas that are based in what? Compulsory sexuality. Why? Because what the fuck do you mean? What do you mean a healthy amount of sex? A healthy amount of sex for me is very different from a healthy amount of sex for you. But even the idea of having a healthy sex life is like a euphemism for that guy. Yeah, that guy has a lot of sex. And it's nothing problematic, but he has a lot of sex. This is a big problem. But it's a big problem for some reasons that might come off a little bit subtle. And yeah, like Nicholas Kim Coppola says, I've had other ace people be weird and pushy about my boundaries as an ace person. We need to educate others and ourselves so much more about sexuality and consent. This is a big part of it, right? Again, that lets down ace people is the fact that we don't treat ace people as fully human, because our method of inclusivity is one where we try to just paper over potential negatives existing or assign specific sexualities with a type of benevolence. And in particular, compulsory sexuality is this real force that anybody is subject to being pushed by, is subject to obeying in various different ways, even down to the thing that basically everybody, but not everybody, does, which is put some effort into presenting their own appearance so as to be, seen as desirable. Show us the cat, please. No. Olivia Grace, consent and grape culture is a big issue. I feel like especially since the Me Too movement died down, no one is talking about consent anymore. I think people are talking about it, but I think the ways in which we talk about it have gotten better and worse in certain ways. We'll get into that more because there is some stuff that Olivia Grace wrote in a post that I want to share. So these are the ideas of sexlessness that play into compulsory sexuality. Sexless as a bad thing. In some ways, too much sex is also potentially compulsory sexuality because there's an idea of a threshold of how much sex a person should and shouldn't have and what that sex should look like. And that doesn't necessarily even change when you have progressive ideas about sex. Because you might be the kind of person that, is very pro queer sex and very pro like kink, which is, great for you. But if you then carry that into ideas of, well, these folks, they don't do kink, so that's not good. They're not really tapped into their sexuality in a healthy way or whatever. That's your own creation of a new type of compulsory sexuality. Other people should have sex. They should have it like this, right? But the compulsory sexuality that actually exists is one that favors very specific people. And not favors them in a healthy way, but favors them in a power way. So this is where we get to an idea that this is where, shit gets real controversial. I'm going to need everybody to just take a deep breath. I need everybody to just hear me out because there's a good chance I'm not saying the thing that you think I'm saying. But here we go. Let's talk about sex-obsessed culture and the question behind it, moral panic or colonial control. So sometimes we hear this phrase, we live in a sex-obsessed culture. And I think the common response from a progressive standpoint would be to label that kind of label as puritanical, as conservative, as based in like Christian dogma. And that in a lot of cases can be true. For instance, it's not uncommon to hear purity culture, people espousing purity culture in Christian fundamentalist spaces talk about how sex-obsessed our culture is. Oh, there's so much sex. We're so obsessed with sex and culture. And it's not godly, right? Purity culture, though, is just another form of trying to control people's sex, trying to control people's sexual impulses and desires and their behaviors and the way that they reflect on sex. It's just another coin of compulsory sexuality because purity culture is not encouraging you to be asexual in behavior. It's not encouraging you to just leave everybody alone and don't reproduce. Purity culture is encouraging you to have sex and reproduce in a very specific way. That's what purity culture is saying. And so this is where the problem comes when we talk about asexual critiques of compulsory sexuality and the idea of this sex-obsessed culture. Because while there is a fundamentalist right-wing purity culture critique of sex-obsessed culture, there is also the asexual critique of sex-obsessed culture, which is saying a lot of you guys are weird about sex. A lot of you guys are weird about your sexual urges. You're weird about how you talk about sex. You're weird about how you do stuff. And you make it normal, but it's not okay. And you force it on other people. It's a lot. And while there can be crossover, especially from a person who is trying to make the asexual perspective critique of this, but isn't necessarily thinking that thoughtfully about how to say it, these are still different things. When people talk about sex-obsessed culture, they should be able to do so in a way that doesn't automatically get grouped in as a moral panic. Especially because I would say that a lot of the progressive folks that I've met that have talked about obsessed culture in this way aren't doing so out of the sense of we want to stop people from having sex or we want to restrict anybody from their urges. We want to control. It's in fact the opposite. There is a tacit form of control that exists beyond just even don't do this. It's encouraging people and encouraging people and encouraging people to sexualize themselves this way and to have this and that kind of sexual relationship. Does that make sense? It's a social control. And a lot of times, even in spaces where the idea is we don't want to control people's sexual impulses, we want to be sex positive, there's still sexual control going on that's not getting properly analyzed critically, for better and for worse, which leads to then a lot of stuff getting by that shouldn't get by. Carl's Jr. commercials, great example. I want to talk about other examples like that, but I also want to mention that I'm using this term colonial control as a part of it. We know that a key part of coloniality, of colonialism, is ideas of sex, ideas of controlling people's sexual urges, ideas about races and groups of people being more pure, and certain people being inherently sexual, having too much sex desire, etc. So a lot of this coloniality reproduces itself when we ignore the asexual critique of obsessed culture. Because just because you are putting forward sexuality does not mean you're being sex positive, and it does not mean you're doing so in a way that isn't colonial. So I want to start here. You mentioned Carl's Jr. commercials. I Raise You. Honora, the 2024 movie. This was a movie that I would say is not like a bad movie from an art standpoint. Cool shot composition, good acting performances, and it was a phenomenon. But the underlying politics of the film, or lack thereof, you could say, communicate to us some things that we should really think about in terms of how we think about sex. Because this is a film about a sex worker, and it has some pretty reductive implications without making direct statements or direct ideological points in the work. It can present a pretty reductive image about the sex worker, and perhaps more than that, it really is an example of how glorified sexual imagery, even of very obvious sexual exploitation, right, being depicted as something that's positive, as something that is necessarily good. And necessarily, if you are saying that this has to be worthy of critique, or that this is exploitative, or that this isn't good, that's necessarily you being sex negative. Marxist analysis coming? In a way. Yeah. So I want to bring people's attention to this article. I think I did this before as well, from Marla Cruz, Romance Labor on Sean Baker's Honora. And she speaks from the sex worker perspective about how this movie does ultimately neglect any type of solidarity with actual sex workers in favor of presenting sex workers in ways that are ultimately titillating. We can't deny that there's some amount of titillation that is being presented here. It's sexiness. And also in ways that are, compulsive sexuality in a different form, presenting certain ideas about what the sex worker is and how she lives and what she thinks. So she starts it saying, over the last decade, Sean Baker has produced 4 sex worker-centered films, while at the same time, sex workers in America have experienced a series of major political losses, Baker being the director of Honora, of course. The 2024 presidential election gave us the choice to vote between 2 people responsible for those losses, Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. As California Attorney General, Harris was instrumental in the federal government's seizure and shutdown of Backpage.com, a popular website where sex workers advertised their services, on April 6, 2018. Just 5 days later, Trump signed SESTA/FOSTA into law, making website owners liable for the criminal sexual activity of their site's users, effectively shuttering multiple platforms where sex workers advertised and shared industry-related information with each other. After losing the online platforms necessary to work independently and indoors, the poorest sex workers had no choice but to find clients in the streets and through coercive managers. Many sex workers were abused, exploited, and even murdered under these worsening conditions. Trump's victory over Harris marks the forward march of the reactionary sexual politics that has threatened the safety and livelihoods of sex workers since I was 19 years old, posting ads on the now defunct Craigslist personals page. We sex workers would continue to suffer regardless of which candidate won. When asked by the LA Times about the political potential of his films given their marginalized subjects, Baker, who was recently in Saudi Arabia talking about how great Saudi Arabia is for film, Baker spoke about his art in the language of the chattering class. I don't want to preach, he explained. We are already so incredibly divided as a country that if I start preaching my politics, I'm going to alienate 50% of the population. I think that art is about bringing people together and sparking discussion. Art cannot unify without engaging with the reality that we do not all experience alienation the same way. And I'll sort of conclude also with a little bit from the ending passage. Whatever satisfaction I could have derived from the representation of sex workers in film is suffocated by the condescension of liberal representation politics. Here we go. Inclusivity is not enough. Representation politics wherein marginalized people are depicted as most authentic in states of suffering. Workers are corrupted, made less by capitalism's devaluation of our humanity. Market liberalism and its progressive-minded adherents accept us as workers in order to efficiently exploit us. Yes, workers are workers, and the workers' role in this system is toiling for the ruling class. Honora conceives of our exploitation and abuse as the most relevant factors in understanding who we are as human beings. Look at how broken sex workers are by capitalism. The film says, as if society did not already treat us as broken, exploited objects. In Honora, the sex worker is exactly who society thinks she is. This film essentially doesn't give you a complex dive into the humanity and the lived reality of the sex worker, but it's very successful. Why? Because it's presenting the sex worker in ways that compulsive sexuality really likes. For one, look at how hot she is. Look at how hot some of the sexy stuff she does is. And for two, oh, look at how sad she is because she's not doing this the way that she should be doing this. She can't have a full and happy and realized life because she does sex work. And that does not fall into compulsive sexuality's ideology. So compulsive sexuality can both be, and for a lot of y'all really is, at the same time, sex is so hot, sex is so cool, sex is great, look at all the sex. And also purity politics. It's both at the same time. And that's why for a lot of folks, the idea that I'm doing pro-sex politics, right? I'm super like not questioning people's impulses at all because I don't want to do purity politics. Bad news, you might be doing purity politics anyway. And just to, kind of hammer this home, and really the capitalistic aspect of this and the culture industry aspect of this, some conversation was brought up last year around this time when Mikey Madison won Best Actress for Anora, because it turns out that a lot of women win Best Actress through doing sex work. And this is like not necessarily a get an Oscar free card, but it has been in multiple careers for women, essentially the way in which they are able to break into the mainstream acceptability and acclaim that they've desired. That's not even to speak about how Hollywood in general sexualizes women like automatically. If you're any type of young actress and you don't want to do something sexy on screen, you're probably not going to get very far in Hollywood. And that's really messed up. So this is an example of like women who have won Oscars by playing sex workers or close enough. Several, okay? The year before Mikey Madison won Best Actress, Emma Stone won Best Actress in Poor Things, a movie wherein at some point her character does sex work. So you're telling me we have to just act like that's nothing. That's nothing because we can't be judgy. We can't be judgy, we can't do purity politics. Okay. Well, this is when we have to talk about sex positive as a cover. And we'll get into it because sex positivity is what we should be striving for, but a lot of folks just don't understand it. And perhaps maybe a new term might be needed in order to try to properly unpack, deconstruct, and attack these systems of oppression. But what we're trying to get at here is that sometimes these films will give you the most straightforward compulsive sexuality possible and then tell you it's sex positive so that they can maintain the progressive bona fides. Somebody made fun of me for saying bona fides last time, but I'm pretty sure if I say bona fides, that's correct. I think bona fide is like the adjective you would use before something, like a bona fide film, but bona fides are something that you have, like your legitimacy. So it gives a film legitimacy among thinking people to say it's sex positive. And this is when we had to have the conversation, guys. There's this elephant right here, and everybody sees it. And so we're just gonna have to talk about it. We gotta talk about Euphoria. What the hell is going on in Euphoria? Okay, I understand that people like the show. They thought that the first 2 seasons were very good. I understand that people have different tastes in art. And I'm trying to not be judgy while also really wanting to question why the compulsive sexuality of Euphoria bothers you now, but didn't bother you in the first 2 seasons. Now, I think from an artistic standpoint, there was more effort put in. There was more effort put in, for instance, to write characters more fully, to talk about their desires and wants and all these things. There's a lot of cinematography stuff in Euphoria that's really, really pretty, really cool to look at. Good acting performances, I'm sure. I didn't watch the show extensively, but everything that I saw in the show and the times that I watched it and in the scenes that I've heard about and watched and read about, it's like, okay, so you have these very conventionally attractive 20-somethings acting as teenagers and being extremely hypersexualized in ways that are very obviously meant to titillate the viewer to some degree. And I'm supposed to pretend like that's not actually the intention because it's actually sex positive, because it's presenting queer people having sex and it's presenting the storylines of how, difficult these things are for the people while also they're having sex. I deny. It's just, for me, it's just like, here's what I feel like, if I'm going to be completely honest. And please don't take offense. This is just my completely honest artistic opinion from somebody who's not like somebody you need to worship or whatever. But like, to me, Euphoria season 1 and 2 is like Joe Biden's ICE. And like Euphoria season 3 is Donald Trump's ICE. It's like, okay, I'm not saying there's no discernible difference, but like the differences are really not as big as a lot of people want to pretend that they are. Joe Biden was having ICE do all the kidnappings and the disappearances and the rampant deportations. So was Barack Obama. Well before Donald Trump did this. But now he's doing things with ICE that are like so visibly objectionable and violent and gross that now we can't pretend like it's not there. We can't just act like, okay, well, it's complicated because border policing is possibly necessary for nation states. No, It's like ICE has to be abolished, right? A similar thing I think has to happen with how we talk about euphoria. I really do think so. I really do think that like even like no judge, like if you got a lot out of euphoria, if you were moved by euphoria in those first 2 seasons, if you connected with it in those first 2 seasons, I understand that that is valuable. I don't want you to feel like you should shame yourself for that. But at the same time, now we know a little bit more and it's 2026 and it's like, we should just abolish it. We should abolish euphoria. That's my personal reflection on it. It's like, even though you related to it more and connected with it more before, and you were willing to avoid the harder conversation about just how exploitative and nasty this was, now you can't avoid that conversation anymore. Are you going to sit here and still try to salvage these first 2 seasons of Euphoria as like, oh, this is something that we should value? Or are you going to be willing to confront the fact that you had these depictions of rape, of sex work that were, you know, at times quite demeaning? Again, that reductive Anora style. People do sex work and it's so tragic and horrible and they can't live full lives, these teenagers, and just showing the idea of teenagers being naked. All this stuff. And obviously a lot of it was meant to titillate you. And I know this because Sydney Sweeney launched a whole career off of Euphoria that was basically, look at how hot Sydney Sweeney is, Sydney Sweeney's boobs. And the basis of that was, remember the scenes in Euphoria, that show where she plays a teenager, how good her boobs looked? That's what that was. So you can't sit here and tell me that this exploitation and this compulsive sexuality that we're seeing in Euphoria now is just like brand new. Euphoria reformists. Yeah, you guys can't be reformist about this show. You guys can't be blue MAGA about Euphoria, okay? Literally blue MAGA because they missed the blue. They missed the blue color on screen. They missed the blue eyeshadow. You guys are blue MAGA about Euphoria. Cindy Sweeney boobs jeans good. Exactly. So now, if you're not up to date, essentially, Euphoria Season 3 has presented scenes as part of the marketing where Sydney Sweeney is dressed up like a sexy puppy. And then there's one that I'm obviously not going to show on screen. There's a still of her, because her whole arc in this show now is that she's doing like OnlyFans kind of thing. There's a still of her dressed up like a baby, scantily clad with a pacifier in her mouth. It's just disgusting. Additionally, the 4 main women characters of the show are apparently engaged in sex work in the show. Great. Okay, and then also there's like scenes where there have to be drug mules and there's very obvious like fetish content of them like struggling to like and gagging on ingesting the drugs. It's just, where do we draw the line and why wasn't it 5 years ago? Well, because it's very easy to straddle that line between sex positive and sex negative, essentially. It's very easy to cover purity culture in a different form, which is the submissiveness of white women and how sexy that is and how sexy they are when they do that. And like how tragic it is when you have to have sex in ways that aren't compulsive sexuality. And like teenagers having sex is bad, but also very enticing. All this stuff is compulsive sexuality. All this stuff is patriarchy. All this stuff is rape culture. Or, you know, Epstein culture, right? To use a term that doesn't get censored as aggressively. All this stuff was that. But now it's ugly. Now it's not artistically redeemable. And why was it redeemable? Yeah, exactly. That's not even remotely sex positive. But because it got to market itself as about queerness, and it got to market itself as sex positive women, and also got to, of course, market itself as like, oh, it's like Skins, it's like kids, it's like showing kids what's really going on. Yeah, for sure. That's what teenagers are going through right now. They look like Sydney Sweeney and they do all the cool makeup stuff. And for sure, those are realistic characters. Absolutely. Jacob Elordi's character is super realistic, for sure. A lot of you guys were just titillated by it and you didn't want to question it. And it gave you the guises necessary to say, no, I'm actually just like sex positive. And that's not even saying like you can't make a objective evaluation of the work. You're evil if you even touch the show. It's to say like at some point, a lot of folks are taking their thinking caps off and they're acting like it's still on. Mars 8. White dudes really get greenlit to burn millions of dollars in Hollywood. Meanwhile, DEI is the issue. Exactly. And yes, it is copied from an Israeli show. Anyway, a lot of the conversations that were had in the wake of, you know, this new Euphoria season, these corny scenes, the bad wooden acting, and also just like the obvious like exploitation of it, a lot of it was about the Epstein files. It's the Epstein angle. There have been posts on the Euphoria subreddit. Time to wake up, y'all. There's a reason that baby scene with Sydney is included in this season. Look up stress inoculation. The Epstein class is trying to warm you up to the idea of using babies as a sexual kink. So when the evidence comes out of these billionaires and elites abusing babies, there won't be an outrage. And other people have the same theory, right? Literally the idea that Euphoria is being used as a way for people to soften pedophilia, to normalize grooming, essentially, right? To normalize violence, sexual abuse, and to present it as something that's understandable and titillating. And I think that there's a lot of validity to that point. I'll be frank. This person in particular says there's absolutely intentionality behind feeding the general public softcore pedo imagery in an attempt to normalize it or project it as a part of the mainstream lexicon when it's nothing of the sort. It's disturbing patriarchal violence propaganda. I think there's a lot of validity to this, but I will raise you that it's also how the industries work beyond just exonerating people who commit specific acts. It's the reality of compulsive sexuality. It's the reality of chiseling people so that they can be the correct frame of sexuality. That's been done for a while in all types of media. It's a cycle because the media shows you images of what's sexy. Then you're socialized to think this thing is sexy. So then you seek out that media more. What is that? Capitalism. What is that? False needs. Okay? Marxism. We're doing Marxism, right? Capitalism invents problems that only capitalism can fix. And that's how capitalism and patriarchy are like this. Refer to my manosphere talk for more about that. There's even, stuff in the Epstein files that we're pretty sure is real. Emails showing that investment into culture is a key part of how billionaires and this class of people that engage in this type of abuse systematically care about culture and care to manipulate culture. So in reference in 2014 to political unrest in Brazil versus the United States, you want to know why we're not Sao Paulo? Watch the TV ads on the Super Bowl. It's all about hip blacks and hip cars with white women. The group that should be in the streets has been bought off by Jay-Z. Beyond even just talking about the mute compulsion of it and the structure of it, it's something that elites are aware of. They're aware that culture doesn't just exist to just make profit, doesn't just exist to just reflect what the consumer wants. It exists to frame what the consumer wants. It exists to give the consumer what they think they need and also give them the needs. It's a simultaneous process. And that's the kind of thing that happens in societies. And that's what constitutes socialization. And thus, socialization like compulsive sexuality. So, just for more reference on this asexual perspective, this is an article from 2015. What do asexuals think about our sex-obsessed world? On Vice. You have asexual folks talking about feeling different around 12. One of the chicks flashed her breasts and all the guys went wild, but it hardly got my attention. I don't know why the hope of sex would tempt someone to do something they wouldn't do. I find a surprising amount of things are determined and driven by sexual desire. Cook, Zach, cook. Like the example I used above, but also in basically any other interaction, whether it's a job interview, meeting a potential new friend, or even just a brief interaction with a stranger on the street. How people react to you is pretty much mostly driven by how attractive they find you. I find that so strange. That's how it works. That's how it works. It's similar to how racism works. Racism doesn't just work by a white guy going, that black person is bad. It works in so many different systems and creates a socialization, a society, wherein in order to get ahead, you gotta present to people what works with the racist ideology, what works with racism socially. So if you're a black person and you want to get ahead in America, a lot of the keys for you are respectability politics, or vice versa, giving white people the salacious images of black Americans and black people that they love, that they cling to, that confirm their ideas of black people as naturally inherently violent, inherently incontainable. It's funny how those things too, they work together, right? The same thing for sexuality. It's both the hypersexuality and it's the containing. Both of those things appeal to the same ideology. So this has to raise a question now in terms of what we do about it, right? This is how I sort of try to end off my conversations. Let's reflect. And we're going to do so by talking about something that is a little bit triggering, a little bit wild, but has to do with organizing in progressive spaces. I start with this question. Why do we feel so compelled by sex? And what happens when we fail to question our desires and attitudes? So yesterday I posted something on my community posts that is a compilation of images detailing some essentially allegations about the Global Sumud Flotilla. Now, I'm one of those people that has supported the Global Sumud Flotilla, thought it was a good thing. If you don't know what it is, it's essentially those flotillas, boats, activists carrying aid with the intention of bringing it to Gaza and essentially daring the Israeli government to arrest them, which they always do. It is a work of activism, and when done with proper intentionality, it is a God's honest attempt to try to feed people undergoing genocide, right? That's not to say that this isn't something you can criticize. For instance, like how much of this is for show, or how much of this is effective when we know consistently that you're going to be arrested by Israel. But activism is like that. There is no perfect activism. There is no one strategy that we all do and that immediately gets what we want, right? And if there was one, we wouldn't be able to all do it. So activism is about calculating what you're capable of doing, what works. There's a lot of different factors you have to think about: visibility, attention, organizing, God's honest aid attempts, like pressure on institutions. Like all these things do matter. And just because the impact of what you're organizing to do isn't immediate change doesn't mean that it's not worth doing. That said, allegations came out that a member of the steering committee, which is part of the leadership of the Global Samud Flotilla, a senior leader, right, has engaged in sexual relations with multiple activists while on the boat heading towards Gaza. Not one person, not two, three different individuals, all volunteers on a humanitarian mission. And you have to start asking yourself, why? Why? Why would you want to do that? And so I show other related images. Now, unfortunately, the post seems to have been taken down that I took this Instagram sample from. It was Heart of Palestine, that was the account. But there's a couple of things happening here. Quite obviously, if you are in a position of leadership in an organization and you're organizing an event, a trip, and then people volunteer to be part of that trip, and then you, as an organizer of that event, take it upon yourself to sexually proposition 3 of those people, that's an abuse of power. And that is sexual abuse. And I don't care what anybody says, because we're going to get into some of the weird pushback that this is receiving. But I don't care what anybody says. If you're part of an e-board in college and you're organizing a field trip to the museum with a sleepover, and you do that, and then a bunch of people from the school sign up, students sign up to be part of it, and then you do the field trip, and then the night where you do the sleepover, you sleep with somebody who volunteered to be part of it, that's an abuse of power. It doesn't matter if you're physically employing them. It doesn't matter if they consented to it for whatever degree you can argue that this is consent. It doesn't matter that they say, I 100% consented to it. I wanted it 100%. You're not doing the thing you're supposed to be doing. You're using a position of power that's supposed to be about setting, in this case, this example, a God's honest field trip for club activities. And you're really just using it to satisfy sexual urges. And that has obviously negative implications, like, hey, I'm a woman. I want to go on this trip with this club at school, but I hear that people always sleep together when that happens, so I don't want to go because I don't want to be sexually propositioned while I'm just trying to go see a museum. Then there's all the implications about like how much can a person consent, and then all the interpersonal dynamics that happen as a result of it, aside from the fact that you're diminishing the mission. So no, it's not the exact same thing as like your boss at a multi-million-dollar company sexually propositions you and you're a migrant laborer. Obviously, there are degrees you might want to argue about, but sexual abuse is sexual abuse. And so if this is true, if these allegations are true, then this is not something that can be allowed at all. It's reprehensible. But then the second point is like, really? You can't keep it in your pants while you're on a boat going to Gaza? Why would you even want to do that? And I've seen people like respond on social media saying things like, have you ever been stuck on a boat for a few days with a group of people? Obviously somebody's going to want to sleep around. And it's like, but why? Like, why do we just assume that that's a natural thing that should just be accounted for? Well, of course people are going to want to fuck. It doesn't matter if they're trying to literally ship goods on a humanitarian volunteering mission. It doesn't matter that there's all this stuff going on. It doesn't matter if it undermines the purpose. Whatever. People are consenting adults. They can do whatever they want. They can do whatever they want. And it's like, why are we going back here when it's so obvious that this is a case of something that is wrong and abusive and a problem for the people trying to do this sincerely? Why is that the case? But that's where it's compulsive sexuality. Right? And some of the responses that I got on that post kind of reflect this attitude. I understand people asking for perhaps more info. There's a certain amount of revolutionary discipline needed to prevent us from jumping to conclusions before we purge someone. And it's like, yeah, and that revolutionary discipline should probably include, let's maybe not try to have sexual urges satisfied on a volunteering mission. I'm scrolling down to show you guys some of the nonsense, okay? But just don't get too disheartened when you see it. So were there allegations of abuse or not? Because all I see in the slides is that people had sexual relationships, and that is really not the same. The text seems to focus on the fact that people had sex, and yeah, I bet they did. People spending time in closed spaces in high stress environments tend to do that. Completely ignoring the power dynamic issue here. Completely ignoring the contextual problems. Oh, they're spending time in closed spaces in high stress environments. As if said high stress environment isn't literally a boat shipping aid to Gaza. You're just a liberal, Elliot. It's cringe. I think this person got banned, but if not, oh, never mind. This is problematic framing because even if the people were enthusiastically engaging, you're framing this as sexual abuse. It can be sexual abuse, and also the people involved might frame it as that they're enthusiastic about it. I can't believe we have to do this. We would never have to do this if this wasn't some sort of leftist thing. Someone is your boss. You find each other attractive, but you're on minimum wage at the company and he is in an executive position. He sexually propositions you. You're like, yay, that's great. Then you have sex on company time. That is abuse. You can feel how you want about it. That guy should not be doing that. Again, this is where you're actually doing patriarchy, right? This is where, again, we were talking about the racist example before. You can be like, I am so anti-racist, right? I'm so anti-blackness. And then only consume and propagate negative stereotypes about black people, or only associate with black people that meet a certain criteria of respectability in terms of their presentation. That's not the same thing. You're still operating in the same framework. You're just doing it in a more acceptable way. This is the same framework of purity culture, but in a more acceptable way. Well, people have urges, you know? What do purity culture people say? What do people in the church say? Oh, people have urges and they're sinful. What you're saying, oh, well, people have urges and, you know, they should just be allowed to do whatever they want with those urges and they shouldn't have to question. It's just bizarre that that has to be proposed, right? I'll also show, you know, the flotilla's response on Twitter. As a liberation movement, GSF is fundamentally opposed to the abuse of power. We believe the integrity of our movement, blah, blah, blah. We refuse impunity in our own spaces. We have an arm's-length independent ethics committee that was formalized following the 2025 mission, comprised of trained legal professionals, and built specifically to ensure that leadership and power do not influence our accountability processes. This is a permanent foundational part of our structure. We know it's not easy to come forward. When things unfold outside of designated channels, they can escalate in ways that make it harder to protect everyone involved, especially those who may have been harmed. However, we cannot trigger an investigation or hold individuals accountable based on public rumors. A month ago, we reached out and encouraged the author of the recently circulating posts to use the confidential protected reporting pathway so that a rigorous impartial review can take place. To date, we have not received any related complaints. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say like this is the most egregious response of all time, but it's still a problem because you're not thinking about how the fact of your structure existing, it being comprised of trained legal professionals, not only intimidates people who wish to come forward, but also still ultimately comprises, even as arm's length as you can call it, an arm with which you can litigate any complaints that come forward or any unsavory behavior that comes forward to whatever degree is deemed necessary, rather than take direct and concrete action. So essentially, go through the proper trials, go through the proper channels, and then we will go to the ethics committee, and then the ethics committee will sort it out, and there's legal professionals on there, and it's gonna... How is that reassuring to anybody who's like, look, I can't sit here and be like, this is the most obvious violation of all time with the legal system that we currently have, but something fucked up happened. Plus, like, what do you mean? Oh, we can't put it forward if there's not something brought in through those proper channels. First of all, this goes against the account, which said that multiple people went forward about this, or at the very least attempted to make contact with Global Samud Flotilla about this for months. Unfortunately, again, that post was deleted. But it's like, so you seeing this massive thing isn't making you go, oh, okay, let me look into that. Just because it didn't happen in the proper internal channels? Yeah, it's like the military, right? These structures are not great. And like somebody brought up, people were mad when this was a no-no in the encampments, right? There were rules in the encampments protesting for Palestine in 2024. Some of the encampments had rules, no sex. And I remember God's honest activists going online, people who are often very smart, very insightful, very intellectual, saying, this is puritanical. People should be allowed to have sex at the Gaza encampment. And it's like, don't you understand what that opens up in terms of problems for the movement? Don't you understand why a discipline in treating a space a certain way is necessary? I just don't understand. Like, these kinds of excuses we would not make even in other contexts. The Puritans strike again. Like, there's safety measures. And so this, you know, speaks to the left's sexual assault problem and patriarchy on the left that I could talk about a whole other time and go in depth about. But really what I've tried to show you is what Brown writes about in their book. Oppressive ideas are never singular, they write. They are always informed by other interlocking notions of power. We understand oppressions and how they operate much better when we recognize them as being rooted in belief systems that are continually overlapping and converging. Their malleability allows them to take various shapes and manifest in a whole host of ways. The friend zone concept, in which men lament being relegated to platonic friendships with women they feel entitled to have sex or a romance with, is both a product of misogyny and male supremacy. Meanwhile, the hypersexualization and adultification of black children assigned girl, which allows for society to blame them for their own sexual abuse rather than those who perpetuate it, is a product of misogynoir, patriarchy, and white supremacy. Wrapped up with all of this is compulsory sexuality. The nexus where each of these meet is the ideology that sex is not only obligatory, it's just urges, people just do that, but that it is a property and a right owed, especially for those in power to use as they please. Oh, I have a right to sex, I have a right to sex. And this is the same ideology that forms the bedrock for acephobia. It's also what allows many allosexuals not only to believe that asexuals need to be fixed or realigned to conform with dominant social expectations, but also to appoint and empower themselves as the duty-bound authorities who must enact this repair and realignment. We gotta fix these Puritans, a delusion driven by their own entitlement and ego. It's a dangerous and perverse savior complex that results in sexual violence against asexual people, and this fact highlights how much acephobia is deeply rooted in culture. So here's some of my writing. The constant justification of ethically dubious sex as not only unavoidable, but necessary and praiseworthy. I mean, he's just getting laid, what's the problem? And the vilification of anyone who questions it as puritanical is a marker of patriarchy. This type of thing plagues left spaces alongside emphasis on intellectual dominance and the purity of good violence. Again, a whole other video I could get into that. We need to decide if we value our sexual desires, which we know are greatly influenced by socialization, more than the safety of everyone in our space, especially femmes and children. Are you gonna do what makes people feel more safe at the risk of denying your own sexual urges? Well, it helps if you deconstruct, and that's what we try to help people do on this channel. That's what my writing is about. That's what my work is about. It helps if we deconstruct. This is from a blog called Everyday Feminism from 2014, this post. And it has some points about the idea of making decisions in a vacuum. In a lot of ways, this is this enduring sort of critique of uncritical choice feminism. We don't make decisions in a vacuum. I wish we did, but we don't. It is entirely impossible for us to untangle ourselves from our socialization. It plays a part in every single thing that we do, including sex. And while I obviously absolutely believe in and advocate for trying to unlearn the dangerous and oppressive messages that we've been handed down, I think it's uninformed to assume that we are above them. For example, I wear makeup. I like it. I think it's fun. I think it's pretty. I use it because for me, it's an important part of my gender expression, and I actively make the personal choice to use it. However, I'm also bombarded daily, and have been for my entire life, with the message that I'm ugly and therefore, especially as a woman, worthless without it. Do I make my own choice every day about whether or not I want to put on makeup? Yeah. And can it be empowering for me to make a choice for myself? Sure. But do I come to the conclusion to buy mascara in a vacuum? No. So can I ever know for sure whether or not I'd still make the same decision under different circumstances? No, I can't. The same goes for sex. When you think critically, this is the stuff you run into all the time. I really want this thing. I really want this thing. Well, why do I want it? What is that based in? And is this desire really healthy? Is this really going to give me the thing that I think it's going to give me? But rather than do that, a lot of you are still stuck in the pattern of, I want it, and that means I should be respected for wanting it, and it's okay, and it's totally fine. And you're actually just puritanical. Well, I understand why people get tripped up on these things. It's not okay. We've got to do better in 2026 because this is what dooms our attempts to change ourselves and to change the world. I want to help out, but people make me feel ashamed. I want to boycott this product, but people make me feel ashamed. I want to be better in terms of my solidarity, but people make me feel ashamed. Well, I don't want to say toughen up, but get better at deconstructing. Marginalized people know that personally. There is no opting out. There is no, oh, I can look away from the uncomfortable thing. I don't have to deal with the uncomfortable thing. In the case of ace people, there is no, I just don't want to think about sex. You're forced to, because you have a desire that is out of the norm, and you're treated differently because of it. So for those of you who aren't ace, those of us who aren't ace, ooh boy, we have a long way to go. And if we think that this is something that excludes us, we have a lot to learn about the world that we wish to change. But the good news is we're very capable of it. We're very capable of it if we can take a deep breath and walk through that door. Now, are you going to do it or not? Head turner in the chat, James Baldwin quote, "If I turn away from the world, I will die."
You know, when you're little, you think, I would never eat goat cheese. It comes from a goat. I didn't even know they had milk. And then you try it, and it's sort of intriguing. And then after 3 or 4 goat cheese experiences, you know, you like goat cheese.
Did you have to try sex to realize that it was something that you wanted to do?